There is a $2 bag of white powder sitting on the shelf of any hardware store, any garden center, and any drugstore in the United States right now. It looks like coarse sea salt. It feels gritty between your fingers. It dissolves in warm water without leaving a single trace. For the last 400 years, it has been quietly doing the work that pharmaceutical companies now charge Americans thousands of dollars a year to do badly. The compound pulls infection out of wounds. It softens cracked skin so badly damaged it bleeds. It calms muscles that have been knotted for decades. It puts insomniacs to sleep without a single side effect. It draws splinters out of feet without a needle. It heals foot punctures from rusty nails. It cleaned out the wounds of Union Army soldiers after Gettysburg. It softens the toenails of 70-year-old diabetics so they can be trimmed without a single drop of blood. It even makes tomato plants flower twice as long as they would on their own. 30 different documented uses, spread across 3 distinct historical eras. The 1600s, when an English farmer accidentally discovered the compound after watching his cows refuse to drink from a particular spring. The 1740s, when the founder of Methodism wrote it into a household medical book that sold across the British Empire for over a century. In the 1860s, when Union Army surgeons used it as one of their primary battlefield wound disinfectants during the Civil War. 3 centuries, 30 methods, all of them documented. All of them effective. Then one by one, every single one of those 30 uses got quietly removed from American medical practice. Not because they stopped working, because the people who replaced them needed you paying for the rest of your life. I have spent the last few months going through the original 1747 edition of John Wesley's Primitive Physick, the field surgery manuals archived in the Letterman Library at the Presidio in San Francisco, and a handwritten notebook I was lucky enough to read on a farm outside Strasburg, Pennsylvania last fall. That notebook belonged to a Mennonite herbalist named Lydia Baylor. Lydia died in 2004 at the age of 91. The notebook is now in the possession of her great-niece Rebecca, who let me sit at her kitchen table for 2 full days and photograph every page. There are 30 distinct Epsom salt uses written in pencil in that book, organized by the decade Lydia first learned them. The earliest came from her great-grandmother. The most recent came from a Civil War surgeon's almanac her family had saved since 1862. Every single one of them still works today, and Rebecca's family is still using them. Welcome back to Forgotten Home Science, where we dig up the engineering, the chemistry, and the household methods the textbooks stopped teaching. Stay with me on this one, because what is in Lydia's notebook has not been published anywhere, and you will not hear most of it in any other corner of the internet. The compound itself is called magnesium sulfate heptahydrate. The fancy name just means it is a magnesium and sulfur molecule with 7 water molecules locked into its crystal structure. When you dissolve it in warm water, those 7 water molecules release, and the magnesium and sulfur separate into ions that interact with biological tissue in ways modern pharmaceutical chemists have been trying to reproduce in a patent-protected pill for nearly 100 years. They have not succeeded. They will not succeed. Nobody can patent a chemical compound that has been freely available in salt mines and natural springs since long before there was an England or an America or a pharmaceutical industry to argue about who owns it. The story actually starts in the year 1618 in a small town in Surrey, England called Epsom. A local farmer named Henry Wicker noticed something strange about a particular spring on common grazing land. His cows would walk past it. They would drink from any other puddle, any other stream, any other water source within a half mile. But this one spring they would not touch. Wicker tasted the water himself, expected it to be foul, and found it bitter rather than rotten. Bitter the way iron tasted bitter, or alum, or limestone. He let it evaporate in a flat pan and was left with a fine white crystalline powder. He had no idea what it was. Nobody in 1618 did. The terms magnesium and sulfate would not exist for another 200 years. Within a few weeks of Wicker's discovery, a handful of farmers in the area noticed the water did something useful. A man with a deep cut on his hand soaked it in spring water and the wound stopped weeping. A woman with painfully swollen feet from a long day at market dipped them in the spring water and reported the swelling gone by morning. A boy with a splinter buried under the skin of his palm soaked the hand for half an hour and watched the splinter rise to the surface on its own. Within 6 months, people were walking miles to Epsom to bathe in the spring. Within 5 years, the local landowner had built a small pavilion over it and was charging admission. Within 20 years, the Epsom waters were famous across England, and the powder you got by evaporating the water in a pan was the most sought-after household medicine in the British Isles. Lydia Baylor's notebook lists 10 distinct uses that come directly from this 1600s era. Open wound cleaning, where you dissolve 2 tablespoons of the powder in a quart of warm water and soak the wound for 20 minutes. Swollen foot soaking, the same dilution, longer duration, originally used by laborers walking miles to market on cobblestone roads. Splinter extraction, where the salt creates an osmotic gradient that physically pulls the foreign object toward the surface of the skin without any cutting required. Foot puncture healing, which is the one that saved Lydia's grandfather when he stepped on a barn nail in 1924 and avoided what would have been a fatal infection in the era before penicillin. Boil draining, where a hot Epsom compress applied directly to the swollen area opens the head of the boil and allows it to drain naturally within hours. Skin softening for laundresses and farmhands whose hands cracked open from constant water exposure. Horsehoof abscess soaking, which is still standard practice in equine veterinary medicine to this day. Sheep dipping for the parasitic skin conditions that were a constant threat to British wool production. Ingrown toenail relief, the original version of the soak that modern podiatrists still recommend after surgery. And finally, bruise reduction, where a salt poultice applied within hours of an injury measurably reduces the size and duration of the discoloration. Those are 10. Every one of them documented in print in England between 1620 and 1690. Every one of them written in Lydia's notebook in pencil 300 years later. Every one of them still working in Rebecca's kitchen today. Now we move forward to the 1740s, which is where the second cluster of uses comes in. In 1747, a man named John Wesley published a book in London called Primitive Physick. Wesley was the founder of Methodism, one of the largest Protestant denominations in the English-speaking world, and he had a side passion for practical medicine. Primitive Physick was his attempt to write down every effective home remedy he had personally observed or read about across his decades of traveling and preaching. The book was reprinted 43 times between 1747 and 1859. It sat on the shelf of nearly every American frontier household. It was, for over 100 years, the most widely read household medical book in the English language. Wesley devoted 17 entries in Primitive Physick to a single compound, which he called bitter purging salts. The exact compound was Epsom salt. He documented 10 distinct internal and external uses that his readers could apply at home with no doctor required. Constipation relief, where 1 to 2 teaspoons dissolved in warm water taken on an empty stomach reliably moves the bowels within 2 to 4 hours. A use so well documented that the United States Food and Drug Administration approved Epsom salt as an over-the-counter laxative in 1954, and that approval has never been revoked. Gallbladder support, which Wesley described as a regimen of apple cider combined with Epsom salt taken over 5 consecutive days, and which is still being used by tens of thousands of Americans today under the popular name of the gallbladder flush. Sleep induction through a warm evening soak that Wesley recommended for what he called restless humors. Deep muscle ache relief for farmers and laborers after physical work. Postpartum recovery sitz baths for new mothers, which were standard obstetric practice in American hospitals well into the 1970s. Hemorrhoid relief through warm dilute sitting baths. Insect bite poultices applied directly to the bite within minutes of contact. First-degree burn treatment through cool diluted soaks. Highly diluted sore throat gargle for the kind of throat infection that would otherwise require boiling onion broth or willow bark tea, which were the other options in 1747. And finally, tooth abscess soaking through a mouthful of dissolved Epsom salt held against the affected tooth, which Wesley described as reliably reducing the swelling enough for a person to sleep through the night until a proper barber surgeon could pull the tooth in the morning. Now here is the part of this story that should stop you cold. When researchers at the University of Birmingham in England ran a controlled study in 2004 measuring blood magnesium levels in subjects before and after 20-minute soaks in baths containing 1% dissolved Epsom salt, they found measurable plasma magnesium increases in 19 out of 19 test subjects. Every single participant. 2 to 3 sessions per week was enough to produce statistically significant changes in serum magnesium concentration. The exact mechanism is still being argued about in the scientific literature, with some researchers claiming skin barrier penetration through hair follicles and sweat ducts, and others claiming the effect comes from inhalation of magnesium ions vaporized from the warm bath surface. The mechanism does not matter for our purposes. The result was measured. The magnesium got into the body. John Wesley figured this out without a laboratory in 1747. Modern science confirmed it in 2004. The intervening 257 years of medical training in American universities treated Wesley's observations as folklore. That brings us to the third era, which is where Lydia Baylor's notebook gets a little darker, the Civil War. Between 1861 and 1865, Union Army field surgeons were dealing with battlefield wound infection at rates that would terrify a modern emergency room physician. Around 660,000 soldiers died in the Civil War. About 60% of those deaths came from disease and infection rather than from direct combat injury. The Union Army Medical Corps, under the leadership of Surgeon General William Hammond and later Joseph Barnes, deployed Epsom salt as one of their primary general-purpose wound disinfectants. The Letterman Hospital Library archives, named after Jonathan Letterman, who reformed Union field medicine after Antietam, contain surgical manuals from 1862 through 1865 documenting at least 10 distinct battlefield applications. Open wound irrigation after debris removal. Trench foot recovery, which is the condition where prolonged exposure to wet socks causes the skin and tissue of the feet to begin decomposing on the living soldier. Early-stage gangrene management before the condition progressed to require amputation. Surgical instrument disinfection between procedures when no autoclave was available. Field amputation site cleaning to reduce post-operative sepsis. Controlled oral dosing for the dysentery and chronic diarrhea that killed more Union soldiers than Confederate bullets did. Heat stroke recovery through cool diluted Epsom soaks during the brutal summer campaigns of 1864. Saltwater rehydration for the controlled replacement of mineral losses in severely dehydrated soldiers. Eye flushing for the foreign body injuries that came from gunpowder discharge and battlefield debris. And finally, joint stiffness recovery for soldiers who had been bedridden for weeks, recovering from wounds that today would heal in 3 days with antibiotics. That is 30 uses. 10 from the 1600s discovery era at the Epsom Spring. 10 from John Wesley's 1747 household medicine documentation. 10 from the Letterman Library Civil War surgical manuals of the 1860s. Every one of them is in Lydia Baylor's notebook and pencil. Every one of them is still being practiced in Rebecca's family today. Almost none of them are being taught in American medical schools right now. If you are still watching, you are now part of a very small group of Americans who have heard this story out loud. The reason these 30 uses got buried is not a mystery, it is a paper trail. In 1906, the United States Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which created the regulatory framework that would later become the Food and Drug Administration. The original purpose of the act was to prevent fraud in patent medicines, which at the time were the Wild West of American consumer protection. Good intent. But over the next 50 years, the regulatory framework expanded in ways that quietly moved compounds like Epsom salt out of mainstream medical practice and into the category of folk remedies. The biggest shift came in 1962 when Congress passed the Kefauver-Harris Amendment. That law required all drug manufacturers to prove both safety and efficacy through controlled clinical trials before bringing any product to market. The intent was to prevent another thalidomide disaster, which had caused thousands of birth defects in Europe in the late 1950s. Good intent again. But the practical effect on a compound like Epsom salt was devastating. To get formal FDA recognition for any new medical use, a manufacturer now had to spend millions of dollars on clinical trials. No company was going to spend millions to prove that a chemical compound nobody owned worked for treating muscle soreness or constipation or wound disinfection. The patent monopoly that justifies clinical trial expense did not exist. The result was that Epsom salt remained legal but lost its place in formal medical recommendation. Doctors trained after 1965 simply stopped being taught about it. By 1985, an American physician under the age of 40 was statistically unlikely to recommend an Epsom salt soak for anything other than soaking the feet, and even that recommendation was usually framed as a placebo to keep difficult patients pacified. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical industry was building out the alternative. By 2024, the United States market for muscle pain relievers exceeded $15 billion annually. The market for laxatives crossed $8 billion. The market for prescription sleep aids reached $6 billion. The market for wound care products, including hydrogen peroxide alternatives, is over $12 billion. Add up the 30 uses in Lydia Baylor's notebook and assign each one to its modern pharmaceutical replacement, and you are looking at an American consumer market north of $70 billion a year. Every dollar of which is being spent because 2 generations of Americans stopped being taught what their great-great-grandmothers knew for nothing. Rebecca's family does not spend any of it. The 7 of them living on that farm outside Strasburg buy a single 20-pound bag of Epsom salt twice a year at a feed and farm supply store in Lancaster for around $20 total. That is $40 annually for the household. They use it for muscle soreness after field work. They use it as their primary first aid for cuts, splinters, and foot punctures. They use it on the livestock for hoof abscesses and skin parasites. They use it as their cold and flu season throat gargle for the kids. They use it as the household laxative for the older relatives. They use it in their gardens for the tomatoes and peppers and roses. $40 a year replaces what would be several $1,000s in pharmaceutical purchases for a comparable American household of the same size in the same county. Here is how you do it. For external use, the general dilution is 2 cups of Epsom salt to a standard-sized bathtub of warm water, or about half a cup to a basin large enough to soak both feet. 20 minutes is the soak time documented to produce maximum effect for skin softening, mineral absorption, and the osmotic drawing action that pulls splinters and infection toward the surface. For wound cleaning, dissolve 2 tablespoons in a quart of clean warm water and use it as an irrigation solution, pouring the solution directly across the wound surface for at least 60 seconds. For oral use, the FDA-approved dose for constipation relief is 2 to 6 teaspoons dissolved in 8 ounces of water, taken on an empty stomach. Start at the low end. The effect kicks in within 2 to 4 hours. Do not exceed the maximum dose without medical supervision because it can affect electrolyte balance if you push it too far. For garden use, dissolve 1 tablespoon per gallon of water and apply directly to the soil at the base of tomato plants, pepper plants, or rose bushes at the time of first flowering. The application can be repeated every 2 weeks through the growing season. The effect on flower duration and fruit production is measurable and significant in soils that are even mildly magnesium deficient, which describes most American garden soil after a few decades of intensive use. Total cost for the average American household to replicate all 30 uses Lydia Baylor wrote in her notebook is somewhere between $30 and $60 per year, depending on bag size and how much you use, compared to the pharmaceutical equivalent of around $3,000 to $5,000 in household medicine and pain reliever spending over the same period. I want to hear which of these 30 you are going to try first. Tell me in the comments. The soak for the muscle soreness after a long workday. The poultice for the splinter you have been dreading pulling out with tweezers. The Wesley laxative your grandmother probably used. The tomato fertilizer for the plants that have not flowered well in years. There are 30 options on this list, and I read every comment that comes in. Let me know what you are working with, and I will point you toward the specific protocol from Lydia's notebook that fits your situation. If you want to find these videos when they drop, subscribe, and the algorithm will quietly bring the next one to your screen. The next video I am putting out is about a different white powder, this one sitting in a yellow box in every American kitchen, that the same pharmaceutical industry quietly removed from formal medical practice between 1955 and 1972. It has 27 documented household uses going back to the 1860s, and an Amish grandmother in Indiana taught me 3 of them that have not been published anywhere on the internet. I will see you in that one.